The hearing room in the U.S. Capitol was thick with anticipation. The air was so still that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade into the background. All eyes were on the entrance, waiting for the next witness to arrive. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, walked confidently toward the witness table, the sharp navy of her suit cutting through the heavy, polished wood of the chamber. As the cameras flashed, a sense of quiet power radiated from her. She wasn't just here to answer questions, she was here to append the narrative. At the other end of the table sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, the rising star of the Democratic Party, known for her fiery speeches and sharp legal mind. She had been making waves for months with passionate accusations of Republican interference in swing state elections. Today's hearing, she believed, would be the culmination of her tireless efforts to expose corruption and defend the integrity of American democracy. With weeks of preparation behind her, Crockett was certain that she held all the cards. But what she didn't know was that Bondi had been preparing too, and in a way that no one, least of all Crockett, could have expected. The committee room was crowded, filled with lawmakers, journalists, and staff, all eager for the confrontation to begin. The tension was palpable as Crockett, dressed in a bold red blazer, leaned forward into her microphone, her eyes locked on Bondi, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "Miss Bondi," Crockett began, her voice dripping with confidence, "I appreciate your last-minute appearance, though I must note the irregularity of this substitution. Nevertheless, I'll get straight to the point." A few committee members nodded approvingly, sensing the tone she was setting. "For months, my office has been investigating electoral interference across 5 key swing states," Crockett continued, her words crisp and calculated. "We've documented at least 17 instances where Republican officials allegedly attempted to alter election results. Would you agree, Miss Bondi, that this constitutes a threat to our democracy?" Her question was sharp, meant to trap Bondi into a simple yes or no answer. A yes would mean a concession to the narrative she had carefully crafted. A no would allow her to attack Bondi's credibility and suggest that she was dismissing the seriousness of the allegations. Bondi didn't flinch. She adjusted her microphone and met Crockett's gaze without blinking. "I cannot agree with a premise that hasn't been factually established," she replied evenly. "I would like to address each of those 17 claims individually if the committee permits." Crockett's smile tightened slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "Miss Bondi," she said, her tone sharp, "we don't have time for delays. A simple yes or no will suffice." Bondi remained unshaken. "The American people deserve more than simplistic answers to complex questions," she countered, her voice steady and unwavering. "Especially when careers and reputations are at stake." The committee chairman quickly interjected, sensing the growing tension in the room. "The witness will be allowed to respond fully." Crockett's grip on the situation seemed to slip just slightly. She had come into this hearing ready to dominate, confident that her evidence was airtight. But Bondi wasn't here to play by the rules she expected. Bondi's calm, methodical approach had already begun to rattle her. With quiet precision, Bondi began to address the first of Crockett's 17 allegations. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She laid out the facts one by one, presenting evidence that contradicted the claims Crockett had built her investigation upon. As the seconds ticked by, the tension in the room began to rise. Journalists furiously scribbled notes, and the audience leaned in, captivated by the unfolding confrontation. Bondi's quiet confidence was beginning to chip away at Crockett's once unshakable certainty. But Crockett wasn't going to give up so easily. "Miss Bondi," she interrupted, her voice rising slightly, "you're not answering my question. Let me be more specific." She held up a document with a flourish, knowing the eyes of the room were now on her. "This affidavit from a county election official in Georgia claims direct pressure from Republican state leadership to find discrepancies in predominantly Democratic districts. Are you denying that this occurred?" The room fell silent. The document was familiar to everyone. It had been widely reported, a cornerstone of Crockett's narrative. Yet Bondi didn't blink. "I'm familiar with that affidavit, Representative," Bondi said, her tone as calm as ever. "In fact, I have something the committee may find interesting." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder. With a deliberate motion, she placed a document on the display screen for all to see. This, Bondi said, is a sworn statement from the same official, dated 3 weeks later, recanting key portions of that affidavit and clarifying that his words were taken out of context. A murmur rippled through the room. Crockett's face flickered, her usual composure slipping for just a moment before she regained it. She didn't want to believe it. But the evidence was now on the table, and she was running out of ways to control the narrative. The room buzzed with whispers, but Pam Bondi remained composed, her eyes never leaving Representative Jasmine Crockett. The document on the screen had shifted the dynamic entirely, and the weight of the moment hung in the air. Bondi had successfully disarmed one of Crockett's main arguments, but Crockett wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The tension in the room, thick and electric, was palpable as she fought to regain control. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her lips pressed tightly together. She had come into this hearing with a clear purpose: expose Bondi's role in the election interference scheme she'd been investigating for months. But Bondi's quiet confidence was beginning to undermine the narrative Crockett had carefully constructed. The committee chairman cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Representative Crockett, would you like to continue?" Crockett's eyes narrowed. "Yes," she replied, her voice tight but controlled. "Miss Bondi, I'm aware of the document you've just introduced. But it doesn't change the bigger picture. We've seen a pattern emerge in multiple states, and I believe you're attempting to distract this committee from the core issue." Bondi tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here to distract anyone. I'm here to provide the full context. You asked about election interference, and I've provided evidence that contradicts your narrative. If we're going to have a productive discussion, let's focus on facts, not sweeping generalizations." Crockett's pulse quickened, but she held her ground. "I see. And how do you explain the testimony of multiple other officials, state representatives, governors, even local election boards, all of whom have confirmed instances of tampering? Are we to believe that every one of them is simply mistaken?" Bondi didn't hesitate. "I believe you're painting with a very broad brush, Representative. Generalizations are dangerous. It's possible for some individuals to have misunderstood the events or been misled themselves. It's also possible that political motivations have colored some of their testimonies." A murmur rippled through the room. Bondi's ability to deflect and counter every accusation without losing her calm was impressive. But Crockett wasn't backing down. "Are you suggesting that these people who risk their reputations, are all lying?" Crockett shot back, her tone tinged with frustration. "Do you honestly expect this committee to believe that?" Bondi's gaze hardened. "I'm not suggesting anyone is lying. I'm suggesting that when you dig deeper into these allegations, you'll find inconsistencies, perhaps even intentional distortions. This is about the truth, Representative, not about political agendas." For a moment, Crockett's voice wavered, but she quickly regained her composure. She needed to regain control of the room. The weight of the committee's scrutiny was beginning to weigh heavily on her shoulders. "You're not fooling anyone," Crockett said, leaning forward. "We've heard from experts, we've seen the evidence, and we've spoken to voters in these states who feel their voices were silenced. You, Miss Bondi, are part of the system that has perpetuated this corruption." The accusation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Bondi met Crockett's gaze, unfazed. She had been in the political trenches long enough to understand how to weather an attack. "You're accusing me of being part of some conspiracy," Bondi replied, her voice steady but laced with an edge. "But what you're not acknowledging is that we've always had fair and transparent systems in place. Yes, there may have been mistakes. But your framing of these events as a deliberate plot to steal an election is a distortion of the facts." Crockett's jaw tightened. She wasn't used to being challenged in this way. And yet, the room was leaning in, watching as the two women locked in verbal combat, each trying to outmaneuver the other. "Let's talk about the state of Florida, then," Crockett said, narrowing her eyes. "Your state. We've seen reports of long lines, voting machines malfunctioning, and outright intimidation at the polls. And you, let's be honest, didn't do enough to prevent that. You didn't protect voters in your own state." Bondi's eyes flashed. That's a gross oversimplification, Representative Crockett. Florida is a large state with millions of voters. Like any state, we've faced challenges, especially in our urban centers. But I worked tirelessly to ensure that every Floridian had access to the ballot box. What you're doing is using those challenges to paint an inaccurate picture. Oh, I see. So now it's just an inaccuracy? Crockett shot back, her voice rising. Tell that to the people who waited for hours in the heat to cast their votes. Tell them it was just an inaccuracy. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. Bondi's fingers gripped the edges of the table, her calm facade cracking ever so slightly. I don't deny that there were problems, Representative, she said, her voice quieter but firm. But to turn those problems into a false narrative about systematic disenfranchisement? That's misleading the American people. Crockett's frustration boiled over. Miss Bondi, you're the one misleading the people. And you're here today trying to cover up the truth. But you can't hide from the facts. You can't rewrite history. The committee room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Crockett's words hanging in the air. Everyone knew this confrontation was far from over. The stakes had just been raised, and the room was bracing for what came next. The room had gone deathly silent. Every eye was on Bondi and Crockett, two fierce women locked in a high-stakes political duel. The tension was suffocating, as if the very air around them had thickened, charged with a palpable electricity. No one dared to speak, each waiting for the next words, the next move in this verbal chess match. Bondi's lips were pressed into a tight line, but the fire in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew Crockett had struck a nerve. The accusation that she was complicit in a conspiracy to undermine democracy that hit deeper than she cared to admit. But Pam Bondi wasn't one to be easily cornered. She'd weathered too many storms, faced too many battles in her political career, to let this moment define her. With a steady breath, she leaned forward, her voice low and steady, but the intensity of it was undeniable. Representative Crockett, you're accusing me of corruption, of turning a blind eye to voter suppression, but what you fail to recognize is that I've fought for every Floridian to have their voice heard. You want to paint me as the villain in this story, but the truth is far more complicated. I've spent my career fighting to uphold the integrity of our elections, to ensure that every eligible citizen can cast their vote without fear of interference. Crockett, her heart pounding, could feel the crowd's attention shifting. They were hanging on every word Bondi said. But she wasn't ready to lose this battle, not yet. She had one more move. You talk about fighting for voters, Crockett countered, her voice rising with conviction. But the only thing you've fought for is to protect your political career, Miss Bondi. You've turned a blind eye to the people who were silenced, who were pushed aside. I've heard their stories. I've seen their pain. And it's time someone stood up for them. Bondi's expression hardened. And I've heard those stories too, Representative. But what you're doing here is taking the pain of those individuals and turning it into a weapon for political gain. You're using their suffering to fuel your narrative of a stolen election. But the facts don't support that narrative. Crockett's eyes flashed with fury, but she wasn't backing down. I'm not using anyone, Miss Bondi. I'm standing up for the truth. And the truth is that you and people like you have manipulated the system to suit your own ends, and it's time the American people knew it. At that moment, the committee chairman, sensing the mounting tension, raised his hand. I think it's time to wrap this up. We'll give each of you one final statement before we adjourn. Bondi stood up, her posture straight and unyielding, as if the very act of standing was a declaration of her strength. She turned to the chairman, then back to Crockett, her gaze unwavering. Representative Crockett, I don't need to use empty words or baseless accusations to defend myself. I've spent my career working for the people of Florida, and I'll continue to do so. I will not be intimidated by these baseless attacks. I will continue to fight for the integrity of our elections, no matter how many times you try to tear down the truth. Crockett stood as well, her fists clenched by her sides. You may not be intimidated, Miss Bondi, but that's because you've become so entrenched in your own power, you've forgotten what it means to actually fight for the people. You may have a slick rebuttal for every accusation, but you can't hide from the truth. It's time for real change, and it's coming. With those final words, Crockett turned and walked away from the table, leaving the committee room to erupt into chaos. The cameras clicked and flashed, capturing every moment of this confrontation for the world to see. The room buzzed with conversation, and though the hearing was officially over, the battle between Bondi and Crockett was far from finished. Bondi remained seated for a moment, her hands folded neatly on the table. The echo of Crockett's words hung in the air, but Bondi was resolute. She knew the political fight she just endured would ripple out far beyond this room. The battle for the truth, for public trust, was not over. It was only just beginning. As the room emptied, Bondi gathered her papers, straightened her suit, and walked out. Her steps were steady, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that said she wasn't done yet. She had weathered the storm, but the war was far from over. And as for Crockett? She walked out with a fire in her heart, knowing she had struck a blow that would leave a mark. She had exposed the cracks in the system, and she wasn't going to stop until those cracks were healed. The battle lines were drawn. The fight for the soul of American democracy was just beginning, and both Pam Bondi and Jasmine Crockett were ready for whatever came next.